By land or by sea, the A6M-0 was a deadly opponent. Introduced in 1940, this fighter literally outclassed everything in the Pacific theater when America entered World War II. Emphasizing agility, endurance, and firepower, this plane, in the hands of Japan's superbly trained pilots, was well suited to the samurai spirit of total offense. Initially deployed in numbers that overwhelmed local defenses, this lethal combination of man and machine secured for Japan the air superiority that allowed the third largest navy in the world to banish the first and second from the Pacific theater in a matter of months. The Zero's early dominance was eventually countered by evolving Allied tactics, resolve, and a fair amount of good fortune. The short but bitter carrier battles of Coral Sea and Midway were just warm-ups for the 6-month meat grinder that was to be the Guadalcanal campaign. The near-run thing that was 1942 ended up with the carrier air forces of both sides literally exhausted. Over that period, the loss of irreplaceable flight decks was no less disastrous to the Japanese war effort than the depletion of the cream of her elite pilot corps. From 1943 to mid-44, the Japanese Navy tried desperately to rebuild its carrier aviation forces to levels they had started the war with. But by then, U.S. industry had kicked into high gear, and over 2 years had made up its early losses, and then some. As the number of flight decks built in each year shows, Admiral Yamamoto's words were indeed prophetic. I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success. American aviation technology also advanced at a rapid pace, and new fighters, like the outstanding Hellcat and Corsair, now outclassed the Zero in everything except low-speed maneuverability. Just as important as the number of aircraft brought to bear, new American pilots were trained by experienced combat aces, while veteran Japanese pilots flew until they died. By 1944, America's two-pronged approach was in full swing, with the Navy and Marines slugging through the Central Pacific to secure island air bases from which the Army Air Corps could use its brand-new airplane to begin a strategic bombing campaign against Japan's heavy industry and shipyards. This push climaxed with the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in which Japan's newly rebuilt air forces were obliterated in 2 days during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The next objective was to cut off Japan from the oil that fed her war machine. The target chosen was the Philippines. As usual, the Japanese devised a set of complicated plans involving maximum effort, deception, and exquisite timing, but the Battle of Leyte Gulf was again a dismal failure, and they ended up losing much of what was left of their navy. In desperation, the enemy turned to sacrifice to stem the inevitable tide. To secure the island of Luzon, amphibious landings were planned in Lingayen Gulf in early January 1945. The invasion forces, which were to proceed up the east side of the archipelago, would have to run a gauntlet to get there, as intelligence reported that over 250 enemy planes were still on Luzon. We will now focus on 2 days, during which these forces were attacked by kamikaze aircraft on January 5 and 6, 1945. 2 task groups under the command of Admiral Ollendorf proceeded from Leyte Gulf to Lingayen Gulf from January 2 to January 5. Proceeding in 2 formations of roughly equal force, each group consisted of a collection of escort carriers, old battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The escort carriers, with their wooden decks and very flammable contents, were the primary targets for the Japanese. A typical example was the Macon Island. Built on light cruiser hulls, these ships weren't particularly fast, but they did carry 28 aircraft and a collection of anti-aircraft guns. The single-mount 5-inch gun with a range of roughly 6 miles might get off 10 rounds at a plane approaching at 200 knots. The 40mm, with a smaller effective range but a higher rate of fire, had to actually hit a plane to knock it down. The last chance were the 20mm crews, who only had 30 seconds to acquire and hit a target, but no guarantee they would bring a plane down even if they did. The escort carrier's best defense against air attack was, of course, her own aircraft. A typical air wing consisted of 20 obsolete Wildcat fighters and 8 Avenger torpedo bombers. The Combat Air Patrol typically accounted for 60% of kamikaze losses. Note, we started the war with the Wildcat, a poor performer against the Zero, but we traded numbers to offset quality, just like the Shermans versus the Tigers. Advantage of the airframe goes to the Zero. Of the battleships, the USS California, with Admiral Ohlendorf aboard, was the flagship of the task group. Commissioned in 1921, she was not very fast, nor could she go very far in a tank of gas. But she did sport 12 14-inch guns, and at 32,000 tons, she could dish it out and she could take it. Sunk at Pearl Harbor, she'd spent years being rebuilt, and had only returned to battle in mid-44 with a new and impressive anti-aircraft battery. Among the van group, 2 of the heavy cruisers were the USS Louisville and her sister ship, the Portland, and they were real beauties. They were fast, they had long legs, and they were very lean. Their 8-inch guns also gave them a very serious bite. Built in the early 30s, the Louisville was known as the Lady Lou, and also the Lucky Lou, because despite serving in every theater since the outset of the war, and even being hit by a torpedo that did not explode, she had only lost a few of her aircrew in 3 years of near constant service. The Lady Lou and the Portland also had the best anti-aircraft gunnery crews in the entire task group, because they had been in action since day one, while most of the other ships in the group had only been afloat for a year or 2. Rounding out the screen were the destroyers, like the Fletcher-class USS Leutze. Her main job was anti-submarine defense, although she could pitch in on anti-aircraft defense as well. With such formidable defensive forces arrayed against them, kamikaze units adopted every trick to avoid combat air patrols and confuse radar. At Leyte Gulf, the high-altitude attack was most often employed. Approaching in small groups from different directions above 20,000 feet, the planes would push over at 9 miles into a maximum speed power glide that ended in an even steeper angle that carried bombs and a full fuel load into a ship. However, the high-altitude approach could be countered by the Combat Air Patrol and radar-guided anti-aircraft fire from most of the task group. At Lingayen Gulf, the low-level attack was adopted. Now small groups hugging the deck would approach from different directions, out of the sun, through cloud cover, and especially from overland. When in gun range, they would split up and maneuver radically. The Zero, with a fighter pilot at the controls, was the very best at this. When they got close to a carrier, battleship, or cruiser, they would pop up and dive into the deck on final approach. For carriers, they would typically aim at planes on the deck or the island. For battleships and cruisers, they would aim at the bridge. Attacks on destroyers and smaller ships went straight in and attempted to hit the hull at the waterline. They would also fly towards one ship and at the last moment turn quickly to crash into another one nearby before its anti-aircraft guns could engage. Of course, if they were taking hits, they would attempt to crash into the nearest target of opportunity. A grim efficiency was realized in the early going, which only encouraged expansion of the program. Here are the statistics for the first 4 months of the Kamikaze Corps. The numbers below each bar show the kamikaze and normal bombing and torpedo attacks in a given month. Nearly 500 at Leyte, then about 200 a month in November, December, and January. The percentage of kamikaze to normal attacks is given by the yellow bar. Starting in November, nearly 50% of all attacks were kamikaze. The blue bar shows the percentage of kamikaze attacks that either hit or crashed close enough to a ship to cause damage and death, nearly or above 50% for the whole Philippine campaign. The orange bar next to it is the percentage of normal attacks that hit or damaged a ship, 3% or less for every month. These were not tactics adopted by choice. These were tactics adopted by necessity. Unlike most Japanese war records, the kamikaze records are largely intact and are held in reverence at the Yasukuni War Shrine in Tokyo, Japan. Using these primary sources, along with deck logs, action reports, and personal accounts from Allied ships, we will now reconstruct the kamikaze attacks against the USS Louisville on January 5 and 6, 1945. The translated records indicate that on January 5, the Japanese Navy sent 17 Zero fighters and the Army 4 Vals and 3 Oscars to attack the task group 75 miles west of Luzon. They sortied from several airfields north of Manila. Just before sunset, 3 planes came in on the deck and were engaged by the 5-inch battery of the screen. The first plane, likely a decoy, was shot down by the Portland with a direct hit by a 5-inch shell. The second plane was shot down by the Lady Lu just abaft the Australian destroyer Arunta. The third plane was more successful. Minutes before the attack began, 2 destroyers left the inner screen, leaving a big hole on the left side of the formation, which may have been exploited. All 3 low-flying planes used the destroyers to shield themselves from the anti-aircraft fire of the heavy ships. The Louisville sheared out of column to port, several ships reporting her out of control. The destroyer Leutze followed to assist. The plane that hit the Lou was one of the Navy Zeros. We know this because we have a picture with the landing gear down. The measured wheelbase to wingspan ratio is a perfect fit for the Zero. The butcher's bill was extensive, with Captain Hicks, 6 officers, and 56 men being wounded, mostly from flash burns of the 1st and 2nd degree. Only 1 man was killed. The damage to the ship was also extensive, with the number 2 turret completely destroyed, the bridge, Mark IV radar, and 5-inch director badly damaged. Some members of the crew were more fortunate than others. Most of the injured were among the gun crews. Here we show half of the 20mm personnel. 2 in particular, Enrico Trotta and Pappy Blaylock, were extremely lucky. Because these lucky 2 were below decks having dinner when the attack began. Had Enrico been at his normal action station, number 4 20mm mount just below turret 2 on the port side, he also would have been badly injured or killed. Despite the damage, the Louisville led her division in fire support missions the next day, under sporadic air attack, only to have the kamikazes return with a vengeance at sundown. Ollendorf's flagship, the California, was the first ship to get hit, both by the enemy and her own overzealous escort. The light cruiser Columbia was up next, with an Oscar scoring on her fantail. Then another kamikaze dashed through the defenses, passed directly in front of the Leutze, and the Lady Lu is hit again. An encore of death and destruction. Ted Waller, 40mm gun director aboard the Portland just ahead, had a rink-side seat for this one. The attack came in on the deck from the beaches with no radar warning. 8-inch gun captain Paul Franz said they were buzzing around like big angry bees. The Louisville again sheared out of column to port, followed by the Leutze. The Kimberly and Izard also stood by to pick up men in the water from the Lou and Columbia, then rejoined the group outside of Lingayen Gulf. This image, taken from the battleship Colorado, shows the California being hit. Note the heavy smoke from the main battery and anti-aircraft guns of nearly every ship. This smoke effectively screened the attacking planes. The casualties were extremely heavy. Rear Admiral Theodore Chandler, Commander, Cruiser Division 4, 6 officers and 22 men of the Louisville were killed in action. 6 other officers and 49 men were wounded. Most of the wounded were due to shrapnel, most of the dead from burns, many of the 3rd and 4th degree. 10 men were missing in action. Damage to the ship was also extensive. The plane carried a bomb under each wing that exploded on 2 deck levels. On the signal bridge, radar and radio rooms were destroyed. Nearly all radio antennae were damaged, and many specialists, especially among the radiomen, were casualties. Admiral Chandler was also on this deck level when the attack occurred. The other bomb destroyed anti-aircraft mounts and sprayed the area with lethal fragments. The Lady Lou staggered back to her feet, but after regaining the task group, Admiral Ohlendorf decided she'd had enough. The next morning, she was ordered west to operate with the carrier group, where she buried her dead. Then she escorted a large group of cripples to Leyte, where she landed her wounded and began the long trip home. John Duffy, who'd been with the ship since the beginning of the war, was a member of Turret One's crew. In his autobiography, he describes in vivid detail the second attack on the Louisville and the horrors that many of the crewmen felt in the face of the divine wind. All of a sudden, the ship shuddered and I knew we were hit again. I was in charge of the 1st Division men and I yelled, "We're hit, let's go, men." I was the first man out of the turret door, followed by Lieutenant Commander Foster and Lieutenant Haston, our division officer, then a dozen more men. The starboard side of the ship was on fire from the forecastle deck on down. One almost naked body was lying about 10 feet from the turret with the top of his head missing. It was the kamikaze pilot that had hit us. He'd made a direct hit on the communications deck. As men poured out of the turret behind me, they just stood there in shock. Explosions were still coming from the ammunition lockers at the scene of the crash. We could see fire there too. Injured men were screaming for help on the communications deck above us. Duffy ordered his men to help the wounded, and then said, "These orders were given only seconds apart, and everyone responded immediately. But when they got near the dead pilot's body, which was lying right in the way, it slowed them down. I yelled, 'Carl, grab his legs.' As I leaned over the body, I noticed that all he had on was a wraparound white cloth in his groin area. I then grabbed him under the arms and lifted. When I did this, his head rolled back and his brain fell out in one piece onto the deck, as though it had never been part of his body. I told Carl, 'Right over the side with him.' Then I immediately went back and scooped up his brains in both hands and threw them over the side. To the men who had no assignment, I shouted, 'Get scrubbers and clean up this mess.'" A stirring account indeed, but one that raises a couple of questions, which I believe the photographic record can address. First, what type of plane crashed aboard the Louisville on January 6th? And second, did a kamikaze pilot actually end up intact on deck? From the Louisville's action report, she reported 5 Val dive bombers and 1 Kate torpedo bomber were attacking her, and it was the Kate that came aboard. Her sister, the Portland, reported 10 planes attacking, a mixture of Vals and Zeros. 3 destroyers reported what type of aircraft crashed into the Louisville. 2 of them said they were Vals, and 1 said it was a Jill. The Japanese records largely confirm much of the American account. The translated records indicate that the Navy sent 17 Zero fighters, 2 Judy dive bombers, and 1 Jill torpedo bomber, while the Army sortied 4 Val dive bombers, 2 Oscar fighters, and 2 Nick bombers. Note, no Kate is listed. Just before impact, we see the attacking plane in a steep bank. Several features are measurable, including the wingspan and the length of the horizontal stabilizers. A ratio of these 2 lengths provides a unique signature of each plane type that is independent of roll and pitch. Also apparent is the size of the engine cowling. The horizontal stabilizer to wingspan ratio of the attacking plane is 0.39. We will now consider the dimensions of each plane type and try to find a match to the attacking aircraft. Consider the Val dive bomber, where we show a diagram of the plane as seen from directly above, scaled to match the measured wingspan of the attacking aircraft. Clearly, the tail is too small, and the wingspan ratio 0.31 is not a match to 0.39 of the attacking plane. Next up is the Kate torpedo bomber, the plane the Louisville herself said crashed aboard. We see again that the horizontal stabilizers are too small, giving a horizontal stabilizer to wingspan ratio of 0.32. Again, not a match to the attacking aircraft. Next, the Judy dive bomber shows a tail that is now too big, with a ratio of 0.45, but more obvious by far is the very long engine cowling. Regardless of pitch, you cannot hide that nose. Now consider the Jill torpedo bomber. Here the stabilizer to wingspan ratio is 0.38, very close to that of the attacking aircraft's 0.39. A pretty good fit by all accounts. Now consider the Oscar fighter. Again, the stabilizer to wingspan ratio is close, 0.40 versus 0.39. But the shape of the main wing is very distinctive and not like that of the attacking aircraft. Finally, consider the Zero fighter. An exact match in every dimension, but note the tail and the heretofore unnoticed protuberance behind the horizontal stabilizers. Of the 6 aircraft type considered, this is the only one with the horizontal stabilizers mounted ahead of the rear end of the fuselage. Considering all aspects, we see that 3 aircraft, the Jill, Oscar, and Zero, have the most features in common with the attacking plane, with the Judy coming in last place. But we can eliminate the Jill, since she did not carry ordnance on her wings but rather on the center line, while the Zero had hard points on the wings and center line. Considering that 17 Zeros versus 2 Oscars were deployed by the Japanese, balance of probability suggests that for the second time in 2 days, the Lady Lu was struck by a Navy Zero. But how to address the second question? Did a kamikaze pilot actually end up intact on deck? Consider again the fateful image and the path the attacking plane had to take to account for the damage inflicted, and ask yourself, how does a pilot exit an aircraft in such an extreme attitude and end up on deck 100 feet in front of the place the plane impacted? It's not physically possible. So it appears the answer to the second question, did an intact kamikaze pilot end up on deck, is no. Or more precisely, not on January 6th, but consider the photographic record of the attack on January 5. The attacking plane is closing on the Louisville's port bow in a shallow dive. The pilot actually got out of his cockpit and ran across the wing. He made it to the end of the wing, crouched as if to spring, and popped his parachute. But as he tumbled, it failed to fully deploy. Watch the airplane. Another personal account, this time from Ship Surgeon Lieutenant Commander William Johnson, who was at a forward aid station on January 5, with orders to check on Admiral Chandler if the ship got hit. He exited onto the starboard side of the forecastle deck just aft of turret number 1, and immediately came across 2 sailors who were kicking the crap out of a Japanese pilot. The pilot was dead, having been slammed into the ship's side by his parachute that had hung up on the rightmost gun of turret 2. Just as in Duffy's narrative, they cut the parachute cords and tossed him overboard. Dr. Johnson stated that the pilot they threw overboard was in full naval flight suit, while Duffy's account suggested the pilot he threw overboard was wearing only a loincloth. Here are two images of some lads hanging out in loincloth, it's traditional, and some fellows heading out on perhaps their last mission. Note, one of the pilots is wearing a loincloth over his flight suit. It is not a clipboard for navigation. His flight leader just to his left appears to be sporting one of these. Although I cannot confirm that these two pictures are of the same group of people, three of them exhibit a remarkable resemblance to one another. But a jumping kamikaze? Common lore suggests they did not even carry parachutes. In fact, all pilots were issued parachutes, but they mostly used them for seat cushions. According to Saburo Sakai, one of the few surviving Japanese aces, no fighter pilot of any courage would ever permit himself to be captured by the enemy. It was completely unthinkable. And yet this one did. Moreover, I suggest that this was a premeditated act, as the plane had to be going very slow, less than 100 knots, for the pilot to run to the end of the wing, even though the Zero was capable of nearly 300 knots. And if you thought that sequence of events was bizarre, the fate of the damaged number 2 turret was even more so. On the Louisville's return, that turret was replaced by a spare. Then on a return to action at Okinawa, the Louisville was again hit a third time by another kamikaze. The repaired turret sat on a dock for 10 years before being chosen for a very special mission. As a detector station used in the above-ground nuclear test program at the Nevada test site. 60 years later, it's still there, in Area 2, likely to remain there forever. To learn more about the mystery of the gun turret in the desert, consult my technical report or the August 2017 issue of Sea Classics, or, on YouTube, search for Turret Rusting in Desert. And so we pay tribute to the USS Louisville and all who served aboard her. She served her country long after her last salvo was fired. To all who go in harm's way and those who support them, thank you. Many people aided me in this research. Here are some of the principles. But three veterans who were there deserve special attention: Ted Waller, Paul Franz, and Enrico Trotta. Fair wind and following seas.